Okay, today I'll be showing how I made this spiked ball in Blender using geometry nodes to place the spikes around the ball and also to make the chain. Now, this was my first time using geometry nodes and it was a bit of a learning experience. So now I'm going to share what I learned and walk you through every step of the process. But before I start, I just want to mention that I'm using Blender 4.5.2 LTS at the time of this recording. And for my scene units, I'll set them to imperial and inches if you want to follow along. So the first thing I'll do is hit Shift A, go to Mesh, and come down here to Round Cube. But if you don't see this in your menu, you'll need to come up here to the Edit menu, Preferences, go to Add-ons, and then up here in the search box, type Extra. Then enable Extra Mesh Objects, come down here and click Save Preferences, and then close the window. And now when you hit Shift A, you'll see a lot more options here in your menu. So I'll add this round cube, and I'll set the radius to 0.16. I don't really know what this number represents, since I set my units to imperial and inches, so I assume this is just some generic Blender unit or something. But 0.16 seems to be close to 12-inch diameter, so I'm going to go with that. And I'll set the arc value to 6, which again, I don't really know what that means, but 6 looks like a good amount of faces for what I want to create. And now I'll rename this to Sphere and hide it for now so I can create the spike. So I'll hit Shift A and add a cone. I'll leave the vertices set to 32. I'll set radius 1 to 1, or actually I want to set it to 0.31. I'll set the depth to 0.93. And I'll set radius 2 to 0.005. So there's a little flat spot on top. Then I'll switch to Edit mode, Face Selection, and I'll inset this bottom face 0.14. And then I'll extrude it down 0.32. And then I'll extrude it down again 0.15. Then I'll double click on one of these faces to select the entire ring of faces. Then hit Alt E and extrude faces along normals. And I'll set the offset amount to 0.07. Then I'll select this bottom face and hold down the Control key and hit the plus key on the number pad one time to increase the selection. Or you can come up here to the Select menu, go to More Less, and then choose More. And now with all the faces selected, I'll hit X and delete faces. Then switch to Edge Selection, double click to select the Open Edge loop and hit F to fill. And now I'll extrude the face down 0.1. Then double click on one of these faces, but I need to switch to Face Selection. Then double click on one of these faces to select the entire ring of faces. Hit Alt E, extrude faces along normals, and set the offset amount to 0.11. Then I'll switch to Edge Selection, double click to select this edge, then use the Bevel tool to bevel the edge, and I'll set the width to 0.08 and the segments to 8. Then with all these faces still selected, I'll just move them up a little bit, and I'll set that to 0.004. So now I just want to add a few edge loops with the Loop Cut tool to help with smoothing. So anywhere I click, it will add an edge loop at the midpoint. But if I click and drag, I can place the edge loop wherever I want it. So I'll place one here, and another one here. And I think I'll switch to Face Selection and just inset this face here a little bit. And if you see this clipping happening, just come over here and open up this side menu. Then go to the View tab and change the focal length to maybe 100 millimeters or maybe 150 millimeters. And this will allow you to zoom in closer. And I think I'll add a few more edge loops. So there's the spike, but if I switch to object mode, you see the object origin is here towards the top of the spike, and the base is way down here below the world origin. But I want the base of the spike to be sitting up here at the origin, so to do that, I'll switch back to edit mode, face selection, and I'll select this bottom face, and then hit Shift S, and choose Cursor to Selected. And that will move the 3D cursor to the selected face. So now I'll switch back to object mode, and you see my object origin is still up here, but I need it to be down here where the 3D cursor is. So I'll right click, go to Set Origin, and choose Origin to 3D Cursor. And now my object origin is at the base where I need it. So now I can hit Shift S and choose Cursor to World Origin. And now you see my 3D cursor is back up here at the origin. So now I can hit Shift S again and choose Selection to Cursor. And now the spike is sitting up here at the world origin. And this is important because the geometry nodes will use this object origin for placing the spike on the sphere, as you'll see in a few minutes. So the origin needs to be at the base of the spike. So now I'll hit Ctrl A and apply rotation and scale. Then I'll unhide the sphere and move the spike over here where I can see it, and I'll rename it to Spike. And now I'll switch to the Geometry Nodes workspace. And with the sphere selected, I'll click New to create a new node setup. And the first thing I need to do is hit Shift A and add a Join Geometry node, and drop it right here on this line so I can join the spike with the sphere. Next, I'll add a Mesh to Points node, and I'll drop it right here. And I'll connect this geometry output to the mesh input, and then I'll connect the points output to the geometry input here on the join node. And now you see I have these points all over the sphere, but they're actually way too big. So I'll change this radius amount to 0.5. And now you can see the points are being placed on each vertex, which is not what I want. I want them to be placed on the faces. So I'll come back down here and switch this from vertices to faces, and now the points are centered on each face. But I want my spike on the faces, not these points. So I'll hit Shift A and add an Instance on Points node, and I'll drop it right here on this line between the Mesh to Points node and the Join node. And now all the points have disappeared, and that's because I need to specify what I want to use for an instance. And since I have my spike up here in the collection, oh, wait a minute, my node setup has disappeared. So let me click back on the sphere to get back to my node group, and then I'll click this pin button, and that will make sure my node group is always visible if I click on another object. So now if I click on the spike, my node group is still here, so I can click and drag it into the node window. And if I drop it right here below the Mesh to Points node, you see an Object Info node has been created with my spike already selected as the object. So now I'll plug the geometry output into the instance input, and now you see my spikes are appearing on the sphere. But they're all pointing straight up instead of projecting out from the face normals. So I'll hit Shift A and add an Align Rotation to Vector node, and I'll drop it right here below the Object Info node. And I'll plug this output into the rotation input, but nothing has changed, so I need to add a couple more nodes. First, I'll add a Capture Attribute node, and drop it right here on this line between the Group Input and the Mesh to Points node. And I'm going to change this from Point to Face, since I'm aligning these spikes with the faces of the sphere. And then I'll add a normal node and drop it right here behind the Capture Attribute node. And I'll plug the normal output into this empty socket on the Capture Attribute node. And you see it recognizes the node that's plugged in. So now I can plug the normal output into the Vector Input on the Align to Rotation node. And now you see all the spikes are sticking straight out from the faces of the sphere, which looks pretty good. But if you think your spikes are too big or too small, You can select the original spike and scale it up or down, and then hit Ctrl A and apply scale, and that will update all the spikes on the sphere. So this is looking pretty good, but I want to convert these spikes to actual geometry, because right now they're being generated by a modifier. If I click on the sphere, you see here in the modifier panel, there's a geometry nodes modifier applied. And I can turn it off and back on like any other modifier. But if I apply the modifier, you see these spikes disappear. So let me undo that and come back down here to the node group. And I need to add one more node. So I'll hit Shift A and add a Realize Instances node. And I'll drop it right here on this line between the Points node and the Geometry node. And now I can come over here and apply the modifier, and everything gets converted to geometry. So now I'll switch to the Layout tab, Edit mode, and the sphere is already selected. So I'll hit P and Separate by Selection, and now the sphere is separate from the spikes. So I'll switch to Object mode and select the spikes, and now I can add a bevel modifier. Set the amount to 0.005 and the segments to 2, and then I'll add a subdivision surface modifier. And I could leave these settings as they are, but the viewport level setting could cause Blender to lag a little bit, so I like to set this to 0 and leave the render level at 2, so the subdivision will only be applied at render time. Now for the sphere, I didn't want it smooth, I wanted it chunky like this so it would look like metal plating. But I want it to be more defined, so I'll select the sphere and switch to Edit mode, and I'll select one of these faces. Then I can hit Shift G and choose Flat Smooth, and that will select the entire sphere. Then I'll go to the Face menu and choose Extrude Individual Faces. And I'll drag my mouse until I have a small extrusion, and then left click and go to the pop-up menu, and I'll set the offset to 0.04. Then I'll switch to Object mode and add a bevel modifier, and I'll set the amount to 0.02, and I'll leave the segments set to 1. And then I'll right click and Shade Auto Smooth. And I don't need this side menu open, so I'll hit N to close it. And now I want to make a chain to hang the sphere from. So first I need to select the spikes. Switch to Edit mode. And select and delete these 4 spikes at the top. So I'll select a single face on each of them, then hold down the Control key, and then hold down the plus key on the number pad until all the faces are selected, and then I'll hit X and delete faces. And now I'll hit Shift A and add a cube, but first I need to switch to Object mode, and now I can hit Shift A and add a cube. And I'll set the size to 2.5, and then move it up here to the top, and scale it down in the Z direction to flatten it out. And I'll set it right about there. Then I'll hit Ctrl A and apply scale. And then I'll hide the sphere. But for some reason I have 2 spheres. And that's because this one is the spikes. So I'll hide the sphere and I'll rename this one so I know what it is. And then I'll select the cube, switch to Edit mode, select this bottom face and delete it. Then I'll select these edges and bevel them. And I'll set the width to 0.02. And now I need to add some rivets. So I'll switch to Object mode and then hit Shift A and add a round cube. And I'll set the radius to 0.01. And I'll move it up and over here. And I'll scale it down to 0.5. And I'll move it over here into the corner. And then I'll scale it in the Z direction to squash it a little. And then maybe I'll set that to 0.5 on Z. And then I'll move it up a little. And I think that looks pretty good. So I'll right click and set origin to 3D cursor. And then I'll add a mirror modifier on X and Y. And then I'll apply the modifier and right click and shade smooth. And I think that looks pretty good. So now I'm going to rename this to rivets. And then I'll hide everything so I can create a single chain link. So I'll hit Shift A and add a torus. I'll set the major segments to 32. And I'll leave the minor segments set to 12. And I'll set the major radius to 0.53. But that's not right. I need to set the major radius to 0.53 and the minor radius to 0.125. And now I'll hit the number 7 key on the number pad to switch to top view. And I'll switch to edit mode. Then I'll hit Alt Z to switch to X-ray mode and select half the torus. Then hit P and separate by selection. And now I'll switch to object mode and select the separated half and move it over 0.85 in the X direction. And then I'll hold down the Shift key and select the other half. And now with both halves selected, I can right click and join. And now they're back to being one object. So now I can switch to edit mode, edge selection, double click on this edge, then hold down Shift and double click on this edge, and then come up here to the edge menu and choose bridge edge loops. And then I'll do the same thing over here. So now I have a single link, but before I create the chain, I'll switch to object mode, right click and set origin to geometry, and that will move the object origin to the center of the link. Then I'll hit Shift D and duplicate the link and move it over here, and that'll rotate it around 90 degrees and rotate it up 90 degrees. And then I'll hit Shift S and choose selection to cursor. And now I'll unhide the cube and rename it to plate. And I'll rename this torus to plate link. And then I'll move it up here above the plate. And I only need half of this one, so I'll switch to edit mode and use the loop cut tool to place a cut here and here. Then I'll hit Alt Z to switch to X-ray mode and select these faces and delete them. Then I'll get out of X-ray mode, switch back to object mode, and move the link down so it's connecting with the plate. But I want these to flare out at the end, so I'll get back into X-ray mode and back to edit mode. And I'll place a cut here and here. And then I'll move them down to about here. And then I'll select this edge loop and scale it out 1.5 on X and Y. And I'll do the same over here. And then I'll place another cut here and here, and also here and here. And then I'll move these down a little bit. And then I'll switch back to object mode, right click and shade smooth. And I'll add a subdivision surface modifier. And now back here to the original chain link. Since this chain is just going to be straight, I could duplicate this link, move it over, rotate it 90 degrees, and then duplicate it and move it and rotate it again and again until I have the whole chain, and that would work. Or I could use geometry nodes to create the chain, so that's what I'm going to do. So first I'll select the link and then hit Shift D to duplicate it and move it over here to the side. And then I'll switch to edit mode and select the whole thing. And rotate it up 90 degrees. Then I'll switch back to object mode. And over here in the outliner, I'll create a new collection and name it links. And I'll put both of these in here, and I'll rename them to link 1 and link 2. Next, I'll hit Shift A and add a curved path. And I'll create another collection, name it path, and move the path into this collection. You could also use a Bezier curve if you want the chain to curve and snake around, but my chain is just going to be straight, so the curve path works fine. Now I'll jump over to the Geometry Nodes workspace, and with the path selected, I'll click the New button to create a new node group, and then I'll hit Shift A and add an Instance on Points node, and I'll drop it right here on the line. And then I'll hit Shift A and add a Collection Info node, and place it right here. And then I'll click right here where it says Collection, and I'll choose the Links collection, and I'll plug the instance's output into the instance input on the Points node. And now you see the links appearing up here, but they're spaced really far apart, and it's placing both links at each point on the path. So to fix that, I'll enable the Separate Children option and the Reset Children option, but now it's placing both links on top of each other. So I'll enable the Pick Instance option, and now it's alternating between each link. And you can see my original links are still visible, so I can hide those. Now the next issue is that the links are too far apart. So I need to hit Shift A and add a Resample Curve node, and I'll drop it on the line here between the group input and the instance node. And now you see there are more links, but they're still spaced far apart. I can increase the count to add more links, but that still doesn't fix the issue. Also, if I switch to edit mode and grab this endpoint on the path and drag it over, you see the links get further apart. So I'll come back down here and change count to length. And now if I drag this point, you see it keeps the spacing the same and adds more links as necessary. So now I just need to adjust the length until I have the link spacing looking correct. And I think a spacing of 1.65 looks pretty good. But I want the links to have a little bit of random rotation, so I'll hit Shift A and add an Align Rotation to Vector node, and a Random Value node, and a Curve Tangent node. And I'll plug the random value into the rotation input here, and I'll plug the curve tangent into the vector input, and then I'll plug the align node into the rotation input on the instance node. And that's not good, so I need to switch from the z-axis to the x-axis, and that's better. But the default value here is 1, which seems like it's a bit too much. So I'll reduce it down to 0.2, but that's not right. Let me set this back to 1 and change this max value to 0.2. And I'll also set the seed value to 2, and that looks pretty good. And just like with the spikes, I'll add a Realize Instances node, and I'll drop it right here in case I want to convert this chain to geometry later. And I also want to add one more node, so I'll hit Shift A and add a Set Material node. And I'll drop it on the line between the Instance node and the Realize Instances node. And this will allow me to apply a material to the chain without having to convert the chain to geometry. And to do that, all I have to do is click here and pick a material from the list. But for some reason, the material that I had loaded for this tutorial is no longer here. So I'll need to append it back in. But the append is grayed out for some reason. Let me jump back over here to the Layout tab. And it's still grayed out. Wait. I need to be in object mode. Now I can append and browse for my material. And now I'll jump back over to Geometry Nodes. Click here where it says Material and select the rusty metal material. And when I switch to Render Display, you can see the material applied to the chain. So now I'll jump over to the Layout workspace, and I'll select the chain and rotate it up 90 degrees, and move it up, and rotate it around 90 degrees, and position it so it's just touching this bottom link here. And I think that's looking pretty good. So now I can right click and shade smooth, and I'll add a subdivision surface modifier. And you see when the modifier is applied, it shrinks the links up a little bit, which creates a little extra space between them. But all I have to do is unhide the original links and then scale them slightly on the x-axis, and then right click and apply scale, and that will update the links in the chain. So that's looking better. And that's it. So I'll hide these links and unhide everything else. Then I'll come up here and switch to a matte cap, maybe this dark gray one. And that's looking pretty good. So that's about it for this one. If you have any questions or comments, go ahead and post them below. And if you found this video helpful, give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.